Hey team, welcome to Unit 7. I wanted to provide you a little bit of an overview for financial management within grants management. And there are some really key topics here that we need to spend a little bit of time on this unit. And so I'm not going to go through all 87 slides, but I am going to pick up the key points that are stressed by award and effective grants management. And those really circle around audits and monitoring. So let's get the slideshow going and we'll talk through some of the more important elements of being a good steward for grant funds or grant dollars that you get from external agencies. So this presentation was actually put together for the National Community Service Association, and it's also used with AmeriCorps, and so you'll see a lot of their examples have to do with AmeriCorps grants. And let me just start out by saying that we spend our time primarily focused on federal guidelines around effective financial management and how that relates to the OMB circular and what kinds of information they give you in that circular. So just real quick, we focus on federal grants because they're probably the most stringent of all grants or grant funders out there. So if you can get comfortable with the kind of restrictions that are applied by the federal government, then you'll be in a pretty good place. In general, what I found with nonprofits and doing some evaluation work with them, it's not necessarily that they're any less equipped to deal with financial issues, whether that money comes from the federal government or foundations within the state or something at the local level. It's that they are not accustomed to doing the level of recording and documentation and justification that you do with, say, a larger grant. So they don't keep those kinds of records that you would need to be able to, 2 years after the fact, justify a $25.26 expense that you don't remember making, or any of the justification that went behind the decision to expend that money from the grant. So the OMB circulars outline some really important and key elements of effective financial management, and those have to do with what is allowed and what is not allowed in federal grants. And pretty much, if you see it where it's not allowed in federal grants, most agencies will simply pick up their guidelines because it's simple to do. Whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, they provide a really good guideline, so people would just use them anyway. So it doesn't necessarily just apply to federal grants. This tends to trickle down through all grant funding that's received by a program. So the objectives with this particular PowerPoint, and like I said, we're not going to go through all 87 slides. We're just going to go through a handful of them. Is to learn the basics of financial and grants management, review reimbursing, reporting, and rebudgeting issues, and learn about common audit pitfalls and issues. So we're probably going to spend most of our time on that last learning objective. I do encourage you to read through the whole entire PowerPoint. They provide some really, really good information. So these are the 10 areas that they really cover in the PowerPoint. It's really every step along the process where you have money coming into the grant and you're using funding from an external source to pay for a part of a project or a program. So like we said, we have the National Community Service Act of 1990 that governs all federal funding, as do the OMB circulars and other federal regulations. There was a push in the last couple of years to kind of consolidate all the OMB circulars. They used to be separate documents, so you'd have to find the specific one that you needed, download it. So they put that all in one nice big document. So it's now called the OMB Super Circular, and you have a copy of that in this unit so that you can get you caught up on that. You do need to read it, and it does play into your discussion board for this week. There are also state and local regulations that come into play with any type of funding, whether it has to do with federal grant funding or something from a local foundation. And you also need to pay close attention to the notice of your grant award, because this has your terms and conditions that you're agreeing to. This is really one of the most basic constraints on what you can do with money. So you need to read that document closely, because in addition to whatever guidelines they have decided to put into place for the particular grant, they can put in extra ones that have solely to do with the funding agency. Your proposal and your budget should always be your guide. If you have any deviations from the proposed budget, in some cases those deviations need approval by the funding agency. So let's say you have a $100,000 grant and you need to reallocate $20,000, that's probably going to need approval from the grant funder. So you would need to take that to them and get approval before you do it. So they usually tell you what kinds of things you can just make those decisions on your own, and where do they come into play when you need to consult them to actually get approval for a budget change. And then also the notice of funding opportunity, because sometimes they have little nuggets built into the funding opportunity announcement that they don't put anywhere else. It doesn't mean that you're not bound by them. As soon as you submit the proposal, you're agreeing to the terms that are laid out in that funding opportunity. Sometimes there are discrepancies between the two documents, say the funding opportunity document and the grant award. You just want to make sure you understand where those discrepancies come into play and how they impact what you have to do in terms of the financial management of the grant. Like I said, the OMB circular has been around for 60 something, 70 something years. It was a little cumbersome in previous years because, like I said, the circulars were spread out. So you had to go find the one that you needed. They're all now in the super circular, so you don't have to go and find the individual circulars. They're all in one place for everyone. So grant guidelines, as you can see, there are a lot of things that come into the dialogue here, and they could have to do with federal grant guidelines or even just cost principles where you're looking at best practices for expenditures, not necessarily a document that has it outlined, if you expend this kind of money using federal grant funds, then you're probably going to go to jail. So it may not be as strict as that. It may just be something that's a little more informal, but you still need to be aware of it. Because when it comes to justification, you need to say, well, the justification of this is built into the program based on the information in OMB circular number 133. When do you use OMB circulars? Well, you're going to start using them now just to get really acquainted with the requirements for the federal government in terms of effective financial management. Cost principles requirement. This is kind of the common sense approach to how do you allocate funds, how do you expend funds, and how do you do so in a way that's very well thought out, that's consistent, where you don't have a lot of costs deviating from one month to the next, and that you can justify the expense of that money. So cost principles, like I said, these are really, they touch on very specific things and what you can and can't do with federal funding or anything that's governed by the federal principles outlined in the OMB circulars. There are certain things that they just don't pay for. This is a short list of them. Advertising and public relation costs, nope, they don't pay for that. So oftentimes when you go to events and you see this swag, it's a really good way for agencies and organizations to get their name out there and get some, get some people paying attention to them. Unfortunately, that sort of stuff is considered advertising, and you couldn't pay for a single pencil with your organization's name or logo or motto or something like that on the pencil. So you can't do that. They don't pay for memberships, subscriptions, and professional activities costs. So if you want to hold, say, a retreat where you're going to be doing some, trust building, some planning, that sort of stuff, they don't pay for that. Recruiting costs, they don't pay for that. Rental costs, they usually don't pay for that. Training and education costs, the federal government has several training and technical assistance providers for all types of topic areas. So typically they won't pay for training and education because they already pay for it through the TTA grants that they're funding. So they want you to use their training and technical assistance providers. Travel costs, there are restrictions on what you can do with, you can travel and using funds that are, say, come from the federal government, but there are just some restrictions. They restrict how much you can claim for mileage, how much you can pay for a typical ticket. Several years back, they came out with new guidelines on people taking first class trips, even if they weren't expending federal grants to do so. So let's say you want to take a trip and you want to pay for your airfare yourself because you want a first class ticket. It doesn't matter if you pay for that ticket yourself. Um, there's a there's a feeling that taking first class trips on whether it's using federal funds or not, if your grant has federal funds, they don't want to be associated with anybody taking first class trips, so they don't allow that. Administrative requirements, this has to do with keeping things consistent and uniform. So if you buy a computer in 1 year of a grant and you spend $900 on it, if you were to spend anything over that in a subsequent year, they would want a justification because that speaks to consistency, right? If you're going to buy a $5,000 computer, well, why do you need the $5,000 computer? Um, so this we've covered some of this with the pre-award policies, and they cover more of it in here with financial and program management, but also financial management systems and what they have to have the capability to do. There are many programs that will let you look into the finances of your program or your project, and I'll tell you why those are useful in just a minute. But there are some restrictions on what if you use a financial management system, i.e., some type of program like Excel or something else, it has to be able to do certain things. So audit requirements, these are going to be really important because they set a list or an outline of what the expectations are if you undergo an audit. And there's I like to tell students, think of it as the big A and the little A. A little A, AUDIT, is when you do an internal audit all on your own just to make sure that you're where you need to be. A big A means that someone from the outside is coming into your agency to perform an audit for you. Sometimes this is something that you choose to do. You hire an accountant and they do an audit for you. And other times it's not by choice. So I posted an example to Unit 7. That's an audit that I was a part of, well, a long time ago. And that was not something we chose to do. It was something that we had to do because our secretary at the time noticed some discrepancies in how federal funds were being expended, not by me, but by a team prior to me. And so he actually reported it to the federal government and asked them to do an audit. And they came and they did do an audit. And it was one of the tense kinds of audits where they're going to find stuff because you yourself have already found it. And it just becomes an issue of what you have to do in your corrective action planning to get that kind of squared away. So CNCS grant provisions, this is an extra layer of provisions that kind of go outside of the OMB circulars, and they typically have to do with nonprofit awards. So these are some of the requirements for an accounting system. And the reason accounting systems can become important is oftentimes a program, let's say it's the Center for Nonprofit Excellence here in Colorado Springs, they probably have 20 different funding streams that are coming to them so they can achieve their mission and goals and objectives. As you can see here, you don't want it where your money is all mixed up in one big pot. You often hear people talking about pots of money. Those are unique funding streams that each have their own set of expectations and requirements and documentation. And let's say you get a grant from El Pomar. They have their own unique way of accounting for federal or accounting for funding opportunities. And so you need to make sure that you keep those funding streams separate, but then you still retain the picture of the program overall. So that's the big circle with all the little dots in it. So you need to have both. You need to have the functionality to be able to look at individual streams as well as the whole pool. So that's where these accounting systems can really come into play. But it has to be able to allow you to segregate funds. If it doesn't do that, it's not really of much use to you. One of the important requirements of an efficient accounting system is the recording of in-kind contributions. Several years back, there was a finding at the federal level that they were giving funds to others, and then those individuals or programs or grant managers or financial managers had promised an in-kind match. This is when you give something of value to the program or the grant so that it can function properly. So an in-kind contribution would include things like volunteer hours. That's primarily usually involves volunteer hours, but sometimes it's a cash contribution. So you have to keep very careful records of those. Because what they found at the federal level is that people would just put down a number because they thought it looked good. So hey, a 20% match that's great. We're going to do that. And then they weren't really documenting anything, and they didn't have any proof that they had actually done it. And so that was a big concern. So now they really put an emphasis on you tracking your in-kind contribution. And that can be a little tricky. It's a little more labor intensive than other expenses. It's not like printing out a expense report from a credit card or something like that. You need to be able to really prove that you did this. You can read through in terms of what is allowable and what is not allowable. Allowable simply means that under the grant terms and conditions and all the restrictions that come with that particular funding stream, that you are expending money on things that you can spend money on. And this can become really important. I said I would share an example with you. When I was a very, very young grant manager, it was actually my first grant management job, I worked for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. And as the federal grant administrator, I had grantees that reported to me. And if there was ever a question about what they could and could not spend money on, they would come to me and I would give them an approval letter based on my vast knowledge of the topic area at the time. That was meant sarcastically. They would come to me and they would say, can we do this? And I would give them a letter that says, yes, you can. That essentially lets them off the hook for the expenditure and puts me on the hook for the expenditure. So I was pretty careful about these, but I did get caught up in one. I had a grantee that wanted to hold luncheon for people who had volunteered on her project or people who had helped out. And this was a program that really operated across the state, had extensive stakeholder involvement. So it was a way of saying thank you. Now, if you're buying food, not booze, ever, no booze, never, never. If you ever see that in an example activity, it's a no, just no, like no booze. So if you do buy food, it has to be for people who are volunteering in your project or your program. It can't be for, I'm hungry, I'm going to take my colleague out to lunch, or I'm going to take a potential funder out to lunch. No, you can't spend federal money on food unless you're doing this one specific thing. So I approved the request based on what I knew of allowable cost. As it turns out, there were many people at the luncheon who were not volunteers with the program. And when we were audited, that's one of the things that came to light, was that I had approved this particular request. I looked into it. Based on the attendance sheet for those who came to the luncheon, it was revealed that there were, like I said, there were many people, almost half, who were not volunteers. Now, we could have done this two ways. One, the department would have actually paid for this because I approved it. And like I said, then I'm on the hook. They're not. Or we could go to the individuals on the attendance sheet who were not volunteers and ask them if they would simply pay for their lunch, which is what we did. And they did. It was no problem. I mean, it came out to be like $5 and something cents. It wasn't bad at all. And they just paid for it, which really helped me out quite a bit because my department wasn't going to pay for it, which left me being individually on the hook for that kind of money. So allowable simply means that you can spend grant money on that particular line item. So, like I said, if you have foundation money, they often have their own unique set of cost expense principles, and you want to make sure you take a really close look at those. Reasonable. I mean, this is like kind of common sense. They do provide an activity Is it reasonable? No, it's not reasonable because you have one computer that costs $3,000 and the person is getting it because they like the color, or as compared to a $700 computer, which actually meets the objective of this particular purchase, which is simply to provide the computers so that members could learn basic computer skills. So if you can allocate something to a particular project, what does that mean? That simply means that it's both legal and reasonable for you to allocate funds to that particular purchase. Consistent is just consistent. It's the same. It's very similar. So the example I gave you earlier of computer expenses in year one, from year two, they want to see that those things remain the same. And if they don't, if there is a reason that you need a $4,000 computer for the program and you wrote that into the actual proposal, then you don't really need to do much. You can just say, see proposal, page 17, section 2. So this is also a no. Pretty much all their examples are no's. I don't think they provide one that's a yes. Policies and procedures, I'll let you read through this. Internal controls. Okay, so here we go. This has to do with the auditing. Like I said, there's a big A and a little a. Big A's are, I'm not going to say they're bad, but they're usually conducted under a little bit of duress. If the federal government sends you a letter that they're going to come and do a monitoring session with your grant manager, or they're going to audit your program, they typically only do that if they have a sense that there's something wrong. So by the time they get around to sending you a letter like that and setting up the audit, you're not necessarily in trouble because they might not find anything. But auditors, big A, tend to find stuff because that's what they're there for. Even if it's minor things, they'll find some sort of discrepancy in what you said you were going to spend and what you actually spend. So by the time you get to big A, you're kind of in trouble already. They're going to find something and they're going to ask you to do a corrective action plan, which is fine. You can just do that. And then you just have to lay out the steps you're going to take to get yourself back on track with whatever financial issues you might have with your grant. So before you get to that point, you need to implement some internal controls of your project so that you don't get the big A. If you can stick with the little a and do some self-monitoring, self-auditing, then you will really avoid those kinds of issues that would perk the interest of, say, a federal auditor. So again, this is why you would do this. Again, this is an audit with a little a. This is something you do internally. Who's responsible? This is kind of a leadership issue, but also each individual in the program. I mean, if you have a purchase card of any kind, then you have to be, if you go to buy supplies, well, you need to think about, like, is this a reasonable price? I mean, don't get the super soft toilet paper or whatever it is. Just get like a, run-of-the-mill average kind of purchase so that you don't have to justify it. And if you think that they aren't looking at that level, trust me, they are. So you want to keep very good records. So this is a control environment. That's what you're achieving with the internal control systems. It helps you do some risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Administrative cost. I think we've mentioned this before, but this is typically called F&A. You may have seen it referred to F&A in other documents. So there's direct cost. This is what you're going to actually expend to make your project successful. And then indirect cost has to do with administration of the grant itself. It usually is about 15 to 20% of the total cost. So that money goes back into project management, grant management. Whether you have a financial person, it can be split into positions, but it's typically a set percent of the project. There we go. So you can kind of read through that. Yeah, so any kind of entertainment is just a flat no. If it rings of entertainment, it's a no. So you don't want to really have any overlap between what is needed to make your grant a successful project and some of these other grayer areas. All right, I think you can probably read through the rest of this, but I did want to touch on audits and monitoring and the importance of making sure you do everything with that little a to help save you down the road from having to undergo a much more intensive and like I said, it's they're not asking if they can come and do the big A audit. They're just going to come. And like I said, they always find a little something, even if you've done a very, very good job of documenting everything that has to do with your finances in a grant. Documenting expenses, again, you need to apply all of these principles to the expenditure before you make it. If it doesn't meet each one of these requirements, then you need to step back and figure out how you can make that work within your budget so it does meet these requirements. Okay, I think that's about it. I'm going to let you read through the rest of it, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks a bunch.